context, which is the panel which is most devoted to, let's say, the contemporary situation. I want to start immediately with our first speaker, Eva Garau, who could not come because of an impediment, but we are lucky she is able to join us by Skype. Via Skype call. Eva Garau is research fellow at the Department of Contemporary History, University of Cagliari, and lecturer at the Academia University of Rome. She has published a very important book on politics of national identity in Italy, Immigration and Italianità, which remains and is an important book by Rothler in 2015. Our research focuses on national identity, migration policy, right-wing populist political parties, the Catholic Church, and human mobility since the Second Vatican Council, the conceptualization of citizenship and collective belonging, and racism in Italy and Britain. And her talk is From Strangers to Enemies, a historical account of Italian legislation on migration, on immigration and citizenship. Thank you, Garau, for joining us.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me to this workshop. And I would have loved to be there with you. Unfortunately, I decided to play tennis last Monday. So,
Eva, your voice. Eva, I'm sorry, your voice comes broken. Let's see if we can.
Shall I try to get closer? Is it better?
Let's try.
Okay. So, in giving today an overview of the Italian legislation on immigration, I want to start from an episode from 2013. At the point, at the time, the Italian newspaper La Repubblica launched a petition to abrogate the crime of illegal entry, calling for the amendment of the Bossi-Fini law on immigration. Renzi was then Prime Minister. He agreed with the proposal and stated that the Bossi-Fini had to be abrogated. Despite the public reference of this episode, nobody intervened to point out that the crime of illegal entry was not introduced with the Bossi-Fini in 2002, but it was actually introduced in 2009 as part of the so-called security package. Why is this not important? What is relevant? It's relevant because it shows the degree to the extent public opinion and policymakers were hit on
Eva, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your voice comes broken and it's almost impossible to follow.
I'm sorry.
Especially for the, let's say, the non-specialized audience. Would you be able to get a headset, le cuffie, un microfono, so that you talk closer to the microphone? And let's try maybe after the next talk. Would you be able to do that? Or?
Okay, of course. Do you want to let somebody else speak and then we'll try again?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, then I'll mute. Oops. She shut. No, I want to just to let. We'll try again. Okay. Allora, che devo fare qua?
Che devo fare?
Cioè, devo chiudere e passare alla seconda speaker. Okay. Well, we'll try again with Professor Garau in a few minutes. In the meantime, I pass to the second speaker, Angelica Pesarini, our colleague who will talk about la difesa della razza, the resurgence of language and race in the Italian political discourse. Angelica Pesarini is a colleague here at NYU, is lecturer in social and cultural analysis at NYU Florence, where she teaches Black Italia, a course entirely dedicated to the investigation of race, identity, and citizenship in colonial and post-colonial Italy. She was awarded a PhD in sociology in 2015 from the Center of Interdisciplinary Gender Studies at the University of Leeds. Pesarini works investigate the visual racialization practices located at the intersection of race, gender identity in post-colonial times, with a specific focus on Italy. Their current works focuses on issues on racial performativity and coloring, and their latest publication deals with the materialization of the racial body in fascist East Africa through the use of blood. Please. Sì. Allora.
Sì. Slideshow, no? I'll make the slideshow. Perfetto. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. Well, first of all, I would like to start by thanking the organizer of this conference, which unfortunately I missed a bit because this morning I didn't feel very well, but I made an effort to be here. It was really important. So I would like to thank Marcella and Davide, and obviously NYU and La Pietra Dialogue for organizing and putting all of this together. So I would like to start with a quote, which says, "Racism has to be the food for all and everyone. If we really want race consciousness to be alive in Italy, our racism has to be that of blood that runs in my veins, blood that I feel flowing in me, and that I can see, analyze, and compare with the blood of others. Our racism must be that of flesh and muscles, and of the spirit, yes, but a spirit that dwells in these particular bodies, which live in this particular country. Otherwise, we will play into the hands of Metici and Jews. The Jews who, in too many cases, have been able to change their name and confuse themselves with us. There is only one proof to prevent and stop mixing and Judaism, the proof of blood." So, these words by Giorgio Almirante were published on May 5th, 1942, on the magazine La Difesa della Razza, directed by Telesio Interlandi, and running from 1938 until 1943. La Difesa was a magazine promoting cultural and scientific racism, and it became a crucial tool in spreading the fascist racial ideology, especially after the invasion of Ethiopia and the creation of the empire in 1936, along with the promulgation of racial laws in the former colonies in East Africa first in 1937 and then in Italy. Now, it's interesting to consider that in the 80th anniversary of the publication of the Race Manifesto and the enactment of the racial laws, words such as white race, extinction of our race, ethnic substitution, have been explicitly used by some Italian politicians from both far-right wing and openly racist party, such as the former Northern League, now just called League, which is an important change, I think, but also by members of the most mainstream left-wing party in Italy, the PD, Partito Democratico, showing us how ideas of race connected to identity affect transversally the Italian political discourse. The 80th anniversary of the racial laws, however, has also witnessed something else. On February, which is an impressive and shocking number of black people killed and injured on the basis of racial hatred. On February 3rd, Luca Traini, former candidate of the League to the city council's election near Macerata, takes a gun, and from his car, he uses black bodies as targets, shooting in 10 different areas of the city. He injured 6, all African immigrants. Many of us were still recovering from this traumatic episode when a month later, here in Florence, on March 5th, Roberto Pirrone, on the Ponte Amerigo Vespucci, shoots and kills Ididien, a Senegalese citizen who had been living in Florence for almost 20 years. Pirrone said that he shot a random person. However, CCTV images show that before Idi, many other people, all white, walked that bridge. So one may wonder why the only body worth of death was the only black body walking on that bridge. 3 months later, June 2nd, is the turn of Soumaïla Sako to lose his life. The 29-year-old trade unionist and human rights defender from Mali is killed by an invisible gunman whilst collecting scrap metal from an abandoned factory to build a shack in the tent city of San Calogero in Calabria. So now I think it's crucial to wonder, how did we reach this point? Since when being black in Italy has for some turned into a source of fear and danger? In order to answer this question, it's necessary to retrace some phases of the racial history of Italian identity and showing how some factors such as race, color, and blood played and still play a crucial role for the identification processes, and how this mechanism started much earlier than the rise of the fascist regime. As scholar Cristina Lombardi aptly explains, theories on and references to the racial identity of Italians as white are at the core of the project of nationhood since the unification of Italy. However, race in Italy is a tricky matter. And partly this is due to what David Theo Goldberg defines as the racial Europeization. European racial denial, writes Goldberg, concerns wanting race in the wake of World War II categorically to implode, to erase itself. This is a wishful evaporation, never quite enacted, never satisfied, a desire at once frustrated and displaced, racist implication always lingering and diffuse, silenced but assumed, always already returned and hunting, buried and alive. Similarly to the rest of Europe, also in Italy, after World War II and the shame of the Holocaust, race is a category apparently no longer present. However, this is just a fictitious evaporation, as Goldberg reminds us, given that the lack of race certainly does imply lacking of racism. And using Goldberg's words, we can say that in Italy, race, and I quote, has left odorless traces but ones suffocating in the wake of their, at once denied, resinous stench. So race in Italy is a tricky matter because what occurs in Italy is not simply a denial of race. Rather than seeing themselves as white, according to oral historian Alessandro Portelli, Italians see themselves as normal. As a result, because color is unspoken, as Gaia explained very well in her work, color is unspoken and race is not openly mentioned, it is believed that there is no danger of racism. Such a structural color blindness, however, is problematic because it associates whiteness with normality and consequently with national identity. Simply put, to be Italian is to be white. Therefore, those who do not fit the alleged white Italian type are deemed outside the nation on a number of levels. So, as I mentioned earlier, this construction, this racialized construction of citizenship is much older than the rise of the fascist regime. In fact, already in the liberal period, we can see traces of these processes. If by the end of the 18th century, the invention and acceptance of ideas of natural races differing from each other mentally and physically had already been largely institutionalized and accepted, by the end of the 19th century, the threat of racial degeneration had gained a prominent place within European scientific discourse. The development of this debate in Italy played a crucial role for the construction of the racialized black other, essential for the recognition of a difficult whiteness. Italians, in fact, struggled quite a lot in order to become white. In this regard, Gaia actually aptly remarks how the fascist regime used specific discursive reconfigurations to enact a so-called whitening project, capable of absorbing the dark southern Italian other within the realm of the nation, without a clear reclamation of whiteness, but but by identifying blackness and primitivism outside the border of the nation. These ideas also highlight the liminal racial status of Italian. And here, Tatiana Petrovic illustrates perfectly how Italians have been both racializers of Jews and African, but at the same time racialized, for example, when they migrated to the US. As a result, race in Italy today seems to be located within the interstices of a polarized discourse based on notions of unspoken whiteness, able, however, to visually recognize Italians from the others, namely those called stranieri, foreigners, extracomunitari, and now we have this new category, the migrants, immigranti. Although color is not openly named, meaningful biological connotation based on phenotypic features located on the body are at the core of national identity, and the idea of blood particularly plays a crucial role. As many of you already know, Italian citizenship is transmitted by blood through the so-called right of blood, jus sanguinis, according to which a child born to an Italian mother or father is Italian. At present, the issue of citizenship is governed by Law number 91 of 5th February 1992. On the one hand, it's important to remember that some of the reasons behind these connections between blood and citizenship is due to Italian migration abroad. Between 1890 and 1916, 13 million Italians left the country, making this one of the largest voluntary mass migration recorded in history. Moreover, some hosting countries were also enforcing their citizenship on the new arrived, if not immediately, after a few months. Therefore, enforcing ties with blood was probably one of the most powerful ways to plug up this hemorrhagic loss that Italy was facing. On the other hand, however, the use of blood inevitably created a racial citizen, providing with Italian citizenship an aura of sanctity. This idea that citizenship is not gifted, is not a gift. An idea very alive today, as I will show you in a moment. Just to show you how ancient is this idea of blood and citizenship, I would like to give you an example from the colonial history. Specifically, a code made for the first colony, Eritrea, in 1909. With this code, we witness, in fact, the legal racialization of national identity, namely how Italian citizenship and identity became discursively associated with specific meaning, ascribed to measurable phenotypic features located on the body and considered as belonging to Italians. In other words, we can observe the production of the white Italian citizen body performantly constituted with a particular set of discourses regime and how this body became meaningful. Simultaneously, such a discursive maneuver brought about the materialization of the racialized body of the other, irreversibly deemed outside the realm of the nation, precisely because lacking those physical features attributed to the white and therefore to the real Italian citizen. So in this code, a specific article, the Article 8, stated that in case of unknown parents, a child born in the colony, a mixed-race child born in the colony, could gain Italian citizenship only if their physical features showed the presence of Italian blood. Although the code was never implemented, it was used as a juridical framework in cases dealing with the citizenship of mixed-race children. A further development is the Ordinamento Organico per l'Eritrea e la Somalia, so a law promulgated in July 1933. And this law clearly reflects the impact of theorization of race occurring in Italy in those years. So here, mixed-race children, unrecognized, so with unknown parents, could gain Italian citizenship only if they were able to demonstrate on their body the sign of phenotypic feature indicating clear racial intermixing with a member, and I quote, of the white race. So let's think about white race in 1933, and then you will see how it's connected to 2018. So basically, these children had to pass what Barbara Sorgoni defines the proof of race. So this proof was successfully completed after a series of craniometrical tests, including the morphological analysis of the skull and the measurement of cranial capacity. This racial assessment was followed by the cultural assessment of Italianness, demonstrated by the presence in the mixed-race subject of some cultural features able to show, and I quote, the complete assimilation of the dominant racist spirit, such as the level of education, they needed to have a 3rd grade of elementary school, lack of criminal records, monogamy, and religion. So they had to be Christian. So the analysis of these pieces of legislation illustrates the production of the racial body in a specific historical time, and how such materialization brought about the restriction of citizenship rights based on the use of specific racial norms. In this regard, Xavier Indra argues how the racial body marked through color has been historically inscribed with different economies of meaning used to justify hierarchical positions of power. Now, how is this history in 1938 helped to explain 2018? Well, I would like to introduce here my first example. This case refers to the Northern League's candidate, Attilio Fontana, who, on January 2018, said, as you can read, he said, we can't accept them all because if we do, it would mean that we are no longer ourselves as an ethnic fact because they outnumber us, because they're more determined than us to occupy this land. We have to decide if our ethnicity, if our white race, if our society continues to exist or if we will be wiped out. It's not a question of being racist or xenophobic, but a question of being logical and rational. Here we clearly see how Fontana associates ideas of biological race that we have just seen to identity and citizenship. Furthermore, and this is what made his statement particularly controversial, he openly uses not only the word race, but more precisely the word white race, a jargon that recalls not only 19th century theory of racial purity and racial typology, but also the foundation of white suprematist ideological discourses. Hearing this kind of speech from a political figure in 2018, 80th anniversary of the racial laws, reminded us how an idea of biological race connected to Italian national identity, despite being invisible, has never really left. And we clearly smell its rotten smell in the air. So what happens? What are the reactions? A week later, Fontana issues some apologies, but still he promises to expel 100,000 migrants having been elected. I remind you, this was January. In February, we have the shooting in Macerata by a member of the same party, like Fontana and Salvini. Well, Fontana not only wins the regional elections, but he accomplishes victory with a very high margin, 50%, and he becomes the president of the region Lombardy. The second case refers instead to a female MP belonging to the alleged left-wing party, PD. Patrizia Prestipino. This episode occurred at the beginning of the electoral campaign, so we need to go back a bit farther, July 2017. Prestipino has just been offered a place in the Renzi team, namely she's the director of the Animal Protection Department. And she decided to support Renzi's quite criticized idea of creating a mums department. And she says, Italy is a country actually, I would like to read it in Italian for the pleasure of the audience. L'Italia è un paese che rischia tra qualche decennio di non avere più ragazzi italiani. Lo dico senza polemica, però. Uno vuole continuare in qualche maniera la nostra razza, se vogliamo dirla così. Perché è così? Poi per carità va benissimo tutto. Io sono pro ius soli, voglio che venga approvato quanto prima. Ma è chiaro che in Italia gli italiani non fanno più figli. I nuovi italiani, grazie a Dio, li stanno facendo, ma gli italiani non fanno più figli. Allora si comincia a dare un sostegno alle mamme, se no si rischia l'estinzione in Italia. Reactions. She apologizes a few days later, saying she didn't mean it, she was misunderstood. But similarly, as Fontanas, rather than being condemned by the voter of the PD, she's the most voted PD candidate in Rome for the election of collegi uninominali. So what is interesting here, besides ideas of biological race as a reality, is the use of women's bodies, or more specifically, women's reproductive role exploited to create and represent the nation. Women, as argued by Yuval Davis and Floyantias, are in fact the biological reproducers of citizen, a signifier of ethnic and social differences. In Prestipino's speech, they are used as a symbol for the biological construction of the nation, and women's body is essential to preserve what Prestipino doesn't name, but it's pretty clear, the white race. Here we see what mentioned earlier, how whiteness is unspoken, but clearly floating in the air. She openly makes a distinction between new Italians and other kind of Italians. And you can see the ambiguity here in the speech, how she conflates a number of matters. I am pro ius soli. But what she reiterates in the end is that there are different types of Italian. The new Italians, the one doing the children, and other Italians, the real, the old ones. What is clear, though, that if we want to preserve our race, we need to help a certain kind of Italians. To conclude, we may argue that the analysis of the racial construction of Italian identity is helpful here to reveal the persistence of a specific color line divide, making Italy a racial nation. Ideas of race have clearly been surrounding us in 2018, and in 2018 it seems they may have found a fertile soil in order to re-emerge with a strong sense of entitlement. I think it is our duty as civil society and active citizen to oppose this mechanism, starting, I would say, from the Italian Constitution, from the creation of network of solidarity, in order to achieve lasting forms of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelica Pesarini, thank you for this very evocative and strong talk. I have two announcements to make. As in past panels, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the panel and then collect the question at the end, so mark down your question for the various panelists. The second announcement is that we didn't have one of the speakers in the last panel from Monitor Races, but we are joined by a Professor James Harrington, who will speak for Monitor Racism during this panel. Now we're going to try again to call Eva Garau to see if the connection is better and try to have her talk. Allora,
hello, hi.
Ci siamo. Hi. Okay, we'll try
Can you
again.
hear me now?
Go ahead, we try again. Thank you. I've already introduced again your talk. Let's see. Use.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, you stop me if there's a problem again. So I decided I'll skip the introduction and I'll keep it short. Today, Italy, with the new government, the 3-star, 5-star movement, and the Northern League government, is being judged to be going through a transition, an historical transition, that brought the country where episode of violence, physical and verbal, towards migrants. You can't hear me.
No.
see your faces.
No, it's maybe we can try if you turn off the video. We can
Okay.
try if the voice only works.
Yeah.
There we go.
Better?
Vediamo.
Vediamo. To cut it even shorter, to explain the current situation in Italy with the new government, the new right-wing government, the five-star movement in coalition with the Northern League, I think it's very important to have a look back at the legislation since, very briefly, since World War II. The discussion today is very much focused on the new security decree, which was passed on the 24th of September. I think we can divide the history of Italian legislation into three main phases. The first one goes from 1963 to the early 1990s, and we can call it the legislation without politics. We can call the 1990s the era of solidarity, whereas from 2002 to the present day, we have the identitarian turn. The first measure tackling direct migration is Law 51 of December 1963. Until then, until 1963, we had to rely on fascist laws. The law of 1963 introduced for the first time a link between legal entry in the country and the possession of a valid work contract. It was passed following pressure from public opinion after a wave of migrants from Tunisia arrived following Italians who worked in the fishing industry in Tunisia until the early 1960s. These migrants, for the first time, triggered the debate on the competition and complementarity in the work sector. The first time, migrants were accused of stealing the jobs of Italians. This protectionist approach of this law had the result of forcing part of the labor force into a situation of illegality. Until then, Italy had always relied on the International Labour Organization Convention on Workers' Human Rights. At that point, as I said, immigration was depoliticized. As Einaudi puts it was immigration without politics. In 1973, the oil crisis and the new trend in immigration with the northern countries aiming at a zero-tolerance policy, aiming at restraining migration, we had a new wave of immigration towards southern European countries, such as Italy. Even though the balance in the number of arrivals and departures changed, with more immigrants arriving than Italians departing, the inversion of the trend went unnoticed for at least a decade. Yes, it's true that in 1978, the then Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti commissioned the first inquiry into the state of immigration. This was carried out by the Interministerial Department of Immigration. At that point, Italy didn't have a Department of Immigration. The country still perceived itself as the country, the many diaspora, the country of the Italians living in Italy rather than a country of immigration. The outcome of this investigation was a law number 943 of December 1986, authored by a Christian Democratic member of parliament called Franco Foschi. At this point, there's no trace of any clash of civilization, as we can tell from a statement from the then Minister of Home Affairs, Scalfaro, who in 1983 said, unquote, "Italy has a humanitarian tradition adequate to its civilization, open doors to those who come here in search for freedom." And then he added, "even if we cannot grant a job for everybody." The 1990s can be considered the years of transition. The first measure to deal with the phenomenon in a broader sense than just its its impact on the job market is the Martelli Law of Law 39 of 1990. The aim of this law was then to foster integration, to create, he also created a national monitoring center for immigration, whereas before Italy only had a national monitoring center for emigration, because all the legislation on citizenship, the mobility of workers, is focused very much on the Italians abroad, rather than the immigrants. This law was triggered by the assassination of a refugee called Jerry Maslow in Villa Liberno in 1989. Again, it was public opinion pressure of the government at the time to look at the issue of immigration from a more structured perspective. The 1980s were dominated by a discourse, rather than on immigration, a discourse on the racism of Italians. The comparison with other countries, traditional countries of immigration, such as France, led to the underestimation of the fact that immigration to Italy was not going to be a transitory phenomenon, was not to be an occasional emergency. Since the focus was on the racism of Italians, we have another law in 1993 called Chino Law, which was aimed at punishing any discrimination based race, gender, and sexual orientation, and any apology of the fascist ideology. This is a law that on the 5th of August, I believe, the current minister for the family suggested should be abrogated because it limits the freedom of speech of Italians. This already tells us something about the turn that Italian politics has taken. The consequences, so Martelli, in putting forward this law, demanded open integration and open borders for migrants who wanted to Italy to board. Just after the law was passed, though, Italy faced the consequences of the first Albanian crisis, the arrival in the port of Bari of the ship Flora, carrying 20,000 migrants from Albania. The arrival marked the watershed between the era of solidarity and the era of fear. The invasion syndrome, reinforced by mass media and the discourse of the right, awakened and until then disinterested public opinion. All of a sudden, with the arrival of the Albanians on the ship Flora, Italy realized it had become a country of immigration, although the Albanian crisis was still considered as an occasional phenomenon. A law that was very important in the 1990s that marked the era of solidarity is the Turco-Napolitano law, law number 40 of the 6th of March 1998. The importance of this law resides in the fact that a lot of pressure groups for creating an advocacy coalition took part in the discussion, especially Catholic Association and members of the trade unions. The approach of the law was humanitarian and solidaristic, and it was definitely a bottom-up approach. Yet, the law encountered the opposition of the Northern League and the right-wing parties. So if you look at the first draft and you look at the final text, once it was made non-amendable, the two texts are deeply different. This is something that always happened in Italy with the legislation of immigration. If you look at the first draft and the final draft, the difference is really visible, which is why you identify a huge difference between the legislation passed by the right and the legislation passed by the left until this century. The Turco-Napolitano also created the Center for Identification and Expulsion. So it left, in the end, left the left unsatisfied, but more than anything else, he enraged the Northern League. He gave the feeling to the right-wing parties, the supporters, that too much had done for for the migrants.
Hey,
In the 1990s, we also have a deeply
Pro-
change in the
Professor,
public.
Professor Garau,
Yes.
your connection was very good until now, but now it's getting worse. If you could move to the conclusion, probably, because we are hearing you broken again now.
Okay.
So,
Okay. I'll try to summarize in 2 sentences what I wanted to say today. The first thing is that today we are witnessing very exclusionary policies, a very exclusionary, quasi-racist legislation on immigration. The magazine L'Espresso was published 2 days ago, put on its cover the racial manifesto of 1938, directly linking it to the legislation passed a week ago by the current government. What I wanted to show is that what didn't change is the language. The language of exclusion was already there since the end of the 1990s. That language, back in the past, was perceived as problematic and racist. Through the institutionalization of political parties, such as the Northern League, we witnessed a normalization of racist language. Also, because there was no opposition on advocacy coalition and on the part of the left, this language became not only institutionalized, but the general fear became mainstream. So this is what I call the mainstreaming of fear that led to a legislation that we have today that just passed. It is very much exclusionary, especially because the link between security and immigration that was established in the early 2000s is now completed, in the sense the issue of immigration is included under the broader issue of security, despite the fact that crime related to migration has been declining in Italy since 1992. The deaths in the Mediterranean are increasing after the new decrees to an average of 8 per day. The new restrictive measures have not proved efficient in reducing the number of migrants, but they only increase the number of deaths. I think this is what I really wanted to say.
thank you very much. And let me
Thank you. I'm really sorry, really.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gar, for this synthesis and clarity. I think everybody appreciate the effort.
I tried.
Yes,
tried.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. So at this point, will you need to come over here? So So I will introduce our next speaker, who is Gaia Giuliani, who is a researcher at the Centro de Estudios Sociali at the University of Coimbra, associate professor in political philosophy, and principal investigator of the project The Othering, Deconstructing Risk and Otherness in Portuguese and European Mediascape, and founding member of the interdisciplinary research group on race and racism at the University of Padua. Among her books, it's important to mention the co-authored monographic book Bianco e Nero, Storia dell'identità razziale degli italiani, Black and White, History of Racial Identity of Italians, with Cristina Lombardi, and also the edited book, The Color of the Nation, Il colore della nazione, in 2015. and more recently, Race, Nation, and Gender in Modern Italy, Intersectional Representation in Visual Culture. And she's going to talk Race, Gender, and the Nation in Contemporary Italy. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I guess that the lecture that just preceded me was very interesting. It was given as a sort of a scheme to reflect about, especially to think about how Angelica's and my paper can be reflecting against that temporal structure. And maybe during the question time, we can just, go back to that. So, my paper will somehow recall some of the events that Angelica has already talked about. A Nigerian refugee thought to have fled the terrorist group Boko Haram with his wife has died after being attacked by an ultra football fan in a small Italian town. That was The Guardian in July the 7th, 2016. Emmanuel Chini Nnamdi, 36, died of injuries he sustained when a local man who had reportedly been racially abusing Nnamdi's wife attacked him in the town of Fermo. Amedeo Mancini, 39, allegedly referred to the 24-year-old woman as a monkey and attacked Nnamdi when he attempted to defend her, according to Italian media reports. Nnamdi fell into a coma and was pronounced dead on Wednesday, end of quote. Less than a year later, on May the 12th, 2017, Chidi Nnamdi's killer was released from house arrest. Despite his blatant racism and racist violence against Emmanuel and his wife, Amedeo Mancini was allowed to plea bargain for a lesser sentence and deemed rightfully capable of thriving in Italian society. Arguably, Mancini was released due to the larger societal consent to racism. And yet, there was no process of reflection on the meaning of the court's ruling, the deep-rootedness of racism in Italian culture, and the epistemic value of his offenses. In the same days, and I quote from Al Jazeera, Cécile Kyenge, a black Italian member of European Parliament and ex-minister for integration, has welcomed the Milan court's decision ordering a white supremacist member of the European Parliament from Lega Nord, now Lega, to pay her 50,000 euros for making repeated slurs against her. Two acts of violence, the deadly beating of Emmanuel Chidi Nnamdi and the racial slurs directed at Cécile Kyenge, mirror and amplify a constellation of everyday racist practices. Far from being restricted to members of populist and institutional far-right movements and parties, these involve the population at large and take place in schools, public transports, in the workplace, on the streets and in shops, as well as in public services, hospitals and detention centers. What connects these acts and their corresponding forms of racism, linking events that are either ordinary, that is daily life, and extraordinary, for instance, involving a former member of the government or a murder, is the ease with which racist words can be spoken, insults can be uttered, and cultural connivance and complicity or political consent to institutional racism can be reinforced. In both cases, like in the cases more recently occurred, that is the shooting in Macerata, in Florence, in Vibo Valencia, as have been already mentioned by Angelica. All the culprits, Amedeo Mancini, Luca Traini, Roberto Perrone, Antonio Pontoriero, Mario Borghezio, are male and self-proclaimed white and superior. Their violence stems from the belief that they and Italian society as a whole have been offended by the visible presence of a black refugee couple in their city or by an affluent black woman representing Italianness. The bodily presence of Emmanuel and his wife Cineri in, quoting from Nirmal Poor, spaces from which they have been historically or conceptually excluded is unbearable. A belief expressed without restraint to the point of delivering death to the abusers, the space invaders who disrupt the homogeneity of the color of the nation. The ordinary visibility of a body, as in the case of Shiri Namdi, who was out for a night stroll with his wife, is performed through a signification of the same body as dangerous, which is what Mancini's lawyer maintained, that Shiri Namdi was physically violent, even, and I quote, affiliated with the Nigerian mafia in Italy, end of quote, that his reaction to Mancini's offensive words was one of violence, that Mancini was defending himself against a naturally violent black man. Like in 1992, case of Rodney King's beating by police officers in Los Angeles, in the analysis provided by Judy Butler, King's palm turned away from his body, held above his own head, is read not as self-protection, but as the incipient moments of a physical threat, end of quote. No footage is available on Shiri Namdi's beating. Our visual image of the event is shaped by newspaper stories, photos, and comments provided by television news programs, where eyewitness accounts were edited in such a way that made him appear as the villain, the one who had a stick in his head, with no trace of Mancini DNA on it, by the way, and hit Mancini in the head. The extraordinary visibility of Kyeng, a woman who from a racialized minority, who, and I quote from Nirmal Puars, takes up privileged positions which have not been reserved for her, for which she is not, in short, the somatic norm, end of quote, is performed through a signification that, like in the case of Shiri Namdi, reactivates all the stereotypes in colonial and post-colonial hegemonic discourses on ethnic and racial diversity, so-called, that sustain the unbearability of, in Member of Parliament Roberto Calderoli's words from the Liga, I quote, monkey representing the Italian people and nation cannot be accepted. Opting for visual denial of the racialized television and the press contribute to its invisibilization, as in the case with the exploited African fruit pickers in Rosarno and East European construction workers in earthquake-hit L'Aquila. The Italian media do not usually portray life in migrants' camps or the farms, nor the daily dealings of borders and or the spaces of ordinary life. And even when non-white women and men come into sight, television reporters have no interest in hearing their voices and would sooner chase after the only white person on the scene. Their invisibilization does not conflict with the hypervisibilization of Shiri Namdi and Kyenge. They are distinct aspects of the same discourse in which invisibilization and hypervisibilization of the racialized body and concealment of racism synchronically reinforce white privilege while hiding its mechanisms of operation and reproduction. Race is made invisible when it silently reproduces racialized power relations and is revealed when it is seen as taking space. In both cases, more often than not, racism is concealed, denied, belittled in its cultural purport and social and political consequences. In the case of former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi addressing the then US President Obama as, and I quote, handsome and tanned, end of quote, racism is turned into a joke while blackness is despised, thus reinforcing the white normativity that structures the corridors of power. Mine is an investigation of racism in today's Italy and its modern origins as a rearticulation of the colonial archive, deployed both within the national borders against internal racialized others and in overseas colonies, as well as on its impact on perception and constructions of racist identity politics. In line with Anne Laura Stoller's definition of colonial archive, by it, I mean and I quote, site of knowledge production, a repository of codified beliefs. This archive can be read together with the cultural archive of the Western imperial states, as described by anthropologist Gloria Vecca. That is, and I quote, the memories, the knowledge, and affect with regard to race that were deposited within metropolitan populations and the power relations embedded within them. The conflation of the two archives composed a visual archive of coloniality. These archives were built both locally and transnationally and produced different knowledge according to the reader, the time in history, the social context, and the power relations they serve. In my case, they are to do with the symbolic materials constituting the figures of race, and with them the lens through which events, societies, and situations are hegemonically and racially interpreted in colonial and post-colonial times. By figures of race, I mean images that sediment transnationally over time and crystallize some of the meanings assigned to bodies, which are gendered and racialized in colonial and post-colonial contexts. These figures were and still are used to describe racialized subjects and to racialize those subjected to the violence and barbarism of all forms of primitive accumulation, with its repertoire of mass murder and even genocide, kidnap and forced migration, concentration camps, torture, and the whole panoply of state crime as barbaric and uncivilized. And I quote from the introduction of this beautiful book edited by Monish Bhatia and others. I'm here to interrogate the reasons why Italian racism is so easily concealed and still commonly accepted and reproduced. And I wish to contribute to the analysis of the mutual action of invisibilization and hypervisibilization in the hegemonic discourse of racialized others, which reproduces whiteness as a norm in a self-portrayed, homogeneously white country. Today's threats to national homogeneity and to an apparent discursively constructed racial consistency, even if, or precisely because, such homogeneity has always been very hard to establish, come from clearly defined racialized subjects that are constructed not only to discursively discriminate or justify exploitation and differential inclusion, but also to construct, by contrast, the idea of whiteness, namely the normative charge that structures and gives substance and justification to the racialized social hierarchy that is variously reproduced in the very dishomogeneous Italian society. My method is genealogical, namely, an epistemological method that as such accounts for those elements that, as Foucault says, we tend to feel as without history, and are analyzed as the result of contingent turns of history, not as the outcome of rationally inevitable trends. Indeed, as many Italian international scholars have noted, and I quote from Renate Siebert, in many European countries, Italy included, the word race, after its positivist scientific legitimization in the 19th century and its criminal use by Nazi fascist regimes in the 20th century, has become a sort of taboo. Today's racism has been culturally and politically cleansed of its immediate references to inherited biophysical or genetic abilities or inabilities linked to racial belonging. It is instead openly non-anti-Semitic and exempt from manifest fascist reminiscences, a stratagem that has contributed to the making it popular, but at the same time ferociously anti-Muslim and against immigrants. The attention to cultural text is thus driven by the idea that racist content has moved and still oscillates across the multiple spheres of public and private life in Italy and between a number of different media. Being interdiscursive, hence transmedia and intermedia, it migrates and circulates amongst different modes, visual, textual, oral, etc., which mutually influence each other while coding ideas of sameness, otherness, identity, and diversity that are at the basis of today's global post-colonial condition following Sandro Mezzadra and Federico Raola. The attention to cultural text, however, does not situate this work within a conception of contemporary racism in Italy and Europe as culturalist, or a racism without races. On the contrary, as Robert Young has argued, racism has always been cultural, and the idea of the inferiority of racialized others has never disappeared. To stress the cultural nature of racism, its need for figurations and discursive constructs that interplay with biophysical features through human interpretations means here to forsake claims to post-racialness for the time being. It means acknowledging the capacity of racism to reproduce itself in culture, even when the purpose of the text in which it gets reproduced is not immediately racist. It means acknowledging the institutional character of the cultural reproduction of racism and the role played by cultural habits and institutions claiming white privilege and heteropatriarchy as the racialized and gender interlocking systems of power underlying Italian society. It means revealing the genealogical relationship between the 1930s colonial posters portraying the petite scantily dressed Italian Abyssina or veiled Libyan odalisque, and the sexually attractive and threatening Jezebel in 1970s and 1980s post-colonial Italian advertising and cinema, as I have argued recently. Between the Fellini's visual archive and the persistence of a selected Orientalist and sugar-coated memory of our colonial past, as described recently by Lydia Lungeburg, or between the beauty as white codes fixed by Miss Italia award and the widespread idea of the racialized individuals cannot be beautiful and cannot be Italian, analyzed by Tatiana Petrovich Negos. Between the still very dear to the audience Mondo Canes series by Jacopetti and the animalization, inferiorization, criminalization, and hypersexualization of former colonized and enslaved populations that fills the media discourse of migrants and refugees. Or finally, between representation of the late 18th century anti-colonial hordes of barbarians and images of today boat people landing in Lampedusa, reproduced by both institutions and media. It means, in the uniqueness of each historical context, acknowledging the mutually productive relationship between text and context, between science and power relations, between colonial past, legacies of post-colonial past and legacies, and post-colonial memories. And it means doing it through a gaze that bridges global traveling theories, representations of race, and their local rearticulations, as well as the transnational racialized and gender systems of power they serve. Mine, and not just mine, argument that colonial memory has been neither erased nor suspended, but is elliptically present, quoting from Liliana Elena in my book, and productive, albeit cleansed of the most violent and disturbing experiences of overtly inferiorizing language, as its origins in the historical debate. Stuart Hall's argument on the centrality of visuality in the process of racial signification of bodies is used as a point of reference, along with the works of Judy Butler, John Tagg, Nicholas Mirzoeff, and Fatima Tobin Roney on the right to look, the positionality of the gaze, and the legitimization of the hegemonic Orientalist and racist look, and therefore of white privilege, through the idea of visuality as the dispenser of self-evident truth. This theoretical frame allows me to perform a counterpuntual reading of text and critical interpretations dating back to the three historical periods I have widely discussed in my books on a genealogical base, and investigate the use of visual artifacts in disparate contexts to understand how images can become a tool of an exoticist appropriation of people, sexuality, and land in colonial and post-colonial environments, and the reproduction of the color of the nation. It is within this theoretical analytical context that I also read the relation between border control, color of the nation, and racism in Italian public discourse. On May 11, 2017, in the midst of the refugee crisis and with massive numbers of landings expected in Lampedusa, as the hot season approached, Deborah Serracchiani, president of the region Friuli Venezia Giulia from the Democratic Party, declared that, and I quote, "The crime of rape is all the more serious when the perpetrator is a refugee," end of quote. While her statement was apparently met with coldness and embarrassment by fellow party members, it has been fully endorsed by far-right journalists, commentators, and politicians. What Serracchiani meant to say, she later explained, was that any crime is more serious when it breaks the hospitality agreement, and rather than being just a matter of law breaking or a juridical question, it becomes a matter of ethics. Here, the notion of whiteness as dispenser of rights is grounded in a heteroreferential construction that operates by contrast to the abusive black male other and defines the same whiteness as feminine, benevolent, just, welcoming, non-abusive, and equal. This same imaginary is coupled with that of a land, nation, people, society, white privilege to be defended that explain why, On April 22, 2017, following a confidential report by Frontex that some non-governmental organizations operating rescue boats may be funded by traffickers. Luigi Di Maio was the person that actually read this report, and he was at the time a member of the Parliament for the Movimento 5 Stelle. He dared himself to state that NGOs rescuing ships are akin to taxes for migrants. A milder form of necropolitics is what Di Maio was trying to legitimize, according to which, if and when state and local naval forces are not able to rescue the migrants at sea, the only available option will be to let them die. A few months later, at the end of July 2017, the Interior Minister Marco Minniti, former member of the Communist Party and at the time member of Matteo Renzi's Democratic Party and government, issued a decree limiting NGOs' freedom to operate search and rescue activities in that part of the Mediterranean that is under Italian jurisdiction. NGOs were required to commit to helping Italian police with their investigation and possibly take armed police officers on board. Neither Médecins Sans Frontières nor the German Jugendrettet accepted, considering the request antithetical to the humanitarian principles of neutrality that we adhere to, and we cannot be seen as being part of the conflict. Minniti's decree also prevents NGOs' rescue ship from disembarking migrants at Italian ports. Just like Di Maio's goal of protecting the nation, Minniti's decree, followed by Porti Chiusi, proposed by the new Minister of Interior, Salvini, and his recently approved decree on security and immigration that reduces guarantees for migrants and refugees, are positioned on a spectrum of different degrees of conflation, of criminalization, victimization of migrants, and necropolitics. In each of these cases, the hyper-visibilized bodies of the invaders invisibilize context, reason, and complicities that make the migrants and refugees Mediterranean Middle Passage a miserable experience. Most importantly here, in what has been in my paper a cartography of racist practices in current Italian society, this process of hyper-visibilization of migrants is coupled by both the hyper-visibilization of other racialized bodies of the space invader, like in the case of Chiang and Amdi, and the invisibilization of their exploitation. Altogether, invisibilization and hyper-visibilization conceal the racism that produces and gets reproduced by the proliferation of increasingly secured borders, by the fiction of the color of the nation, and by the missing decolonization of Italian mentality and internal power relations. Thank you.
Giuliani for this powerful intervention. I want to say that we opened this day with the Arturo Marzano, who talked about the myth, among other things, about the myth of Italian good people, and I think one of the results of today's workshop is certainly to have undermined that myth in quite concrete way. I turn now to Professor Jane Renton, academic advisor of Monitor Racism, that is going to talk about this magazine.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry there was some confusion on our part. The magazine, we didn't receive the final program, so we thought we were speaking in this panel as opposed to the one before. So unfortunately, our editor who produced this magazine, it's her brainchild, isn't able to be with us now after that. So unfortunately, you have to put up with me as the substitute. My role in the magazine is as the academic advisor to support the editor, who's based just down the road at the European University Institute. Anyway, before I continue, and I'm only going to be speaking, I understand, for 10 minutes. I'd just like to ask, does anybody in here have a smartphone on them? It's all right, I'm not going to borrow it. I'm not going to phone my mum with your phone or anything.
Only for men is the question, or?
A smartphone or laptop with an internet connection? Anyone with a device with an internet connection? Okay, well, if everybody could please get out your devices, and everyone should have received one of these cards. Does anybody not have one or sit next to anyone? One. And you'll find on the on one side of a card, wonderful cartoons by the magazine's artist Damiano Restivo, trained at the famous School for Comics in Rome, and on the other side, the details of the magazine. And I'd like to introduce you to the new etiquette, certainly in the UK. I don't think it's reached NYU yet, apparently, which is that normally now, when one goes to any event, everybody in the room is on a smartphone looking at other stuff rather than listening to the speaker. Or at best tweeting about the speaker, or one can hope that it's probably the latter rather than the former. But anyway, the new etiquette is to get busy on the phone. So I'd like to encourage everybody now, please, with your device, to type in the tag here for monitorracism.eu and navigate around the magazine while I speak for my 8.5 minutes. So. Okay, I'm terrible. I can't do two things at once, so I'll type first and then speak. Okie dokie. So this is the magazine. So basically, since 2015, it's obvious to say that there's been, for all of the continuities that we've heard about in racism in Europe, there's a huge explosion of racism. One could talk about not just a crisis of racism, but crises that are unfolding and spiraling out of control in all sorts of extremely disturbing and powerful ways. And in response to that, member states have been doing all sorts of things, getting very busy dealing with hate crime, and on a European level. But in this task, there's been something of a division of labor, in that, for example, the special coordinators to fight anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred on behalf of the EU Commission, and indeed the high-level expert group at the EU, work for the most part with two types of organizations: civil society organizations, which thankfully there are many and growing in number all across Europe, and in addition, policy experts within state governments, state administrations, and at a European level. But in all of this activity, there is a missing component. And that missing component are the good people who have been speaking to you today and who write all these wonderful books and journal articles and talk to each other about their profound insights about all of the complexities of racism, who are not at the table of any of this direct activism, state-level action, European-level action. And it's a profound problem because although civil society organizations and government experts are very good at all sorts of levels of campaigning, their task is not to understand all of the nuances and the complexities of racisms and how they evolve. That is the task of the academic scholar. And this is the role of Monitor, Global Intelligence on Racism, to bring the intelligence of the academic expert to public debate on racism and to bring it into contact with policymakers and civil society organizations. And we do this in all sorts of ways. We started with a launch at the UK Houses of Parliament with a research briefing. In January of this year, the magazine was launched the following month, and we had a research briefing there by two academics. I was one of them, a colleague was another, on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And in the room, we had all sorts of civil society organizations and policymakers. We recorded that material, we disseminated it with podcasts, with reports, and video. And this is what we're using on the magazine to distill and communicate all of the wonderful, profound, critical insights that academics are writing about that are just getting lost, that are staying in the pages of journals like Ethnic and Racial Studies or in rooms like this, and not getting out there to the wider public and to policymakers. And I'd just like to show you, if you could bear with me just for a moment. I'm not used to dealing with Apple computers. Okay. As I said, I don't do two things at once, so I shall type. Okay, so one of the ways that we try to bridge the gap between academics and policymakers and the public and civil society organisations is through events. We're going to have a major European-wide event series from September of next year over a 2-year period, and we'll be developing a whole resource base in terms of tools designed to record innovations happening on a city local basis, all the way from Wrocław in Poland, where we're working with the office of the mayor there, across to Stockholm, to Paris, to London, and even to Florence. And one of the ways that we do this is just to really just cut through the jargon, cut through the discourse, cut through the verbiage, and just talk directly. Oh, brilliant. There we go. Another technological glitch. YouTube with no sound. Ah, okay. Is there a way I can unmute it? Well, he looks great anyway. I'm sure you can imagine he's saying lots of profound things. This is Professor Nicola Sturgeon, a really critical scholar who's been at various institutions in Europe, is currently based in Chicago. And this is a 1-minute, straight-to-camera, deliberately lo-fi video where he's explaining the thrust of the article that he wrote for the magazine. Sorry? Ah. Dove? Ah. It's okay. No. Anyway, watch it, listen to it at your leisure, or even now. You know, the new etiquette, scan on your phone as I'm speaking. And the point is this, is that
accumulation at Europe's borders
our goal
of dead
here we go.
brown bodies.
Nicholas is
Europe's
on.
borders are racial borders. And
Okay.
This is what I hope to address in this piece.
Let's listen to Nicholas, shall we?
Over the last few years, we've become accustomed to a discourse of crisis, an unrelenting discourse of crisis regarding migrants and refugees at Europe's borders. This crisis has really been, if anything, a crisis of control, a crisis of sovereignty for European state powers with respect to the control of its borders. The crisis language really escalated beginning in spring of 2015, when there was an unprecedented number of migrant refugee deaths in the Mediterranean. In fact, we've witnessed for years an accumulation of dead migrant and refugee bodies accumulating on the shores of European countries along the Mediterranean. But why is it that these migrant and refugee bodies, these migrant and refugee deaths, are so seldom recognized to be, in fact, an accumulation at Europe's borders of dead black and brown bodies? Europe's borders are racial borders, and this is what I hope to address in this piece.
Now, if you read any of Nicola's prodigious output, his academic publications, they are complex. One has to concentrate and really get stuck in as an academic. But here he's making a very simple point, straight to camera for a wider public, which is the fact that all of these bodies are bodies of colour, and that at the heart of it is a crisis of the racial question of the borders of Europe. And this is the mission of the magazine. It is to bring the academic expert out from the cold and to thrust them in the face of the public at large, but also policymakers and also civil society organizations, to inject the complexity of academic research into our debates, which is so sorely lacking. And that is 25 seconds over 10 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Renton. And now moving to our last speaker, Professor Deborah Spini, one of our colleagues here, who teaches social foundation at NYU Florence, political theory at Syracuse University in Florence, and is adjunct professor in social philosophy at the Cesare Alfieri School of Political Science at the University of Florence. She has very extensive and very intense read of publication, monograph and articles, monographs such as La Società Civile Post-Nazionale, and co-edited several collected books, including Art and Practices of Citizenship, the Protestant Conscience, Civil Society and Global Governance. She's published various essays and chapters, collective books. Spini has also given lectures in Italy and abroad, the most recent in Bangalore University and the University of Madras, Chennai in India. And she's going to talk about the rationalization of religion in Italy. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Right. Okay, let's begin by the end. It is now 10 to 6, so we need something like 20 minutes for discussion, which is clear, and then we also need to have the conclusion at 6:30. So that means that essentially I have 8 to 10 minutes to torment you, which is, I hope, to more or less to convey the point to you in this amount of time. All right. For once, for those who are, friends and colleagues here at La Pietra, you know that, here for us in the La Pietra academic community, race, diversity are concerns that somehow are a part of our identity as an academic community. So for those of you who had the misfortune of hearing me already in these kind of meetings, I would like to clarify right away that today I'm doing something a little bit different. Because in general, I was doing a work of, reading images, while since that today, especially in those 8 minutes, the one thing that I can do, I can throw in perhaps a couple of categories, couple of, criteria to discuss about the racialization of religion. First of all, I think it is important to understand why it is relevant to talk about racialization of religion in Italy. Because, my colleagues who told me they have, as Gaia said, already given a great role to the mito italiano della gente, and you have shown how somehow racism has been a constant component of the Italian public discourse. So what I would like to be interested, what I'm interested to do, what I would like to do now, is somehow to work on a hypocrisy. Because in Italian public discourse nowadays, you can also find the specific kinds of xenophobia that we call Islamophobia, because in fact, as you know, Islam has been targeted, by all these operations of othering that Professor Giuliani was so masterfully speaking about before. Now, what is somehow special about Islamophobia is this, that it may provide the excuse to say we are not racist, because Islam is not a race, Islam is not a color, Islam is a religion. So therefore, we are against a set of principles, we are not against a race. Therefore, you can be Islamophobic and not be racist at the same time. And obviously, as you can imagine to the question, can Islamophobia be considered as a form of racism? Evidently, the answer is yes. This is one of the very, very few images that I'm going to show, but this comes from very close, because this comes from Pisa. As you know, Pisa is about 1 hour by train away. This is an image that was used in the electoral campaign. Is this the destiny of Pisa? something is wrong because here I see a lot of microphones, feel as though I'm the UN, you know, great. Okay, here one could have shown much, you know, more dramatic images. Instead here, I just want to show something a little bit, how can I say, not particularly harmful, also as a sign of respect, you know, I don't want to enter into too much show of blood, suffering, deaths, etc., etc. But see, you know, this is also an example of conflation, because some of you might remember that the very important Egyptian museum in Turin had this idea of giving a discount to all those who were speaking Arabic, no? In order to enlarge, to broaden, let's say, the clientele, the audience of the museum. Allora, I would say this is very interesting because it's the example of a conflation with a conflation. First of all, see how the Arabs are represented. So that means Arab is Muslim. At the same time, if you can see, no, the other, perhaps, I mean, those of you who are not Italian are not fortunate enough to know who is Mrs. Giorgia Meloni, oppure also to see that this is a poster of the Lega, no, of the League. Giorgia Meloni instead is the leader proper of the extreme right. She is, let's say, the Italian version of Marine Le Pen, giusto per capirsi. Allora, vedete, this is a double conflation because on the one hand, evidently, what was the Museo saying? The Museo was saying all Arabs are Muslims because the lady wears an hijab, d'accordo? So that means that, you know, Muslims cannot be, that Arabs cannot be Christian or Arabs cannot be secular. At the same time, you know, this other conflation is they want to offer a discount to Muslims and let's end this shame. Also, not understanding the Muslim and Arabs may be two different things. So, this is just appunto an example of conflation. Here I'm going very quickly because I think, you know, Professor Giuliani said it all. Evidently, you know, race is a cultural construction that somehow uses the body, manipulates the body, but the same body may mean very different things. And here it will be fun, we do not have the same, but you know, this is somehow, which color is your president? Perhaps some of you may recognize one of the past presidents of Brazil, no? Cardoso. Allora, Cardoso belongs to this category. Those of you that are Brazilians, I can't see you at the moment, so I don't know. But I mean, there is this category of pardo, no? That is different. It's not black and it's not white. It's a pardo. Probably President Obama, that, you know, we all think, the first black president. Well, in Brazil, would have been a pardo. So you see that somehow the color line can be used very differently. Here, there is a quote that says in decent English what I've been trying to say in a mixture of Florentine and God knows what. Naturalmente, this is the point. That is to say, racism can be based upon biology, but racism is cultural. And this is what cultural racism does, because, you know, draws on social appearance as the marker, among others. So we can say this definition, I would say, of cultural racism works very well to understand how religion can be racialized. That is to say, how religion can become an identity marker that assumes all the characteristics of being non-changeable, eternal, and ahistorical, as race has been narrated and has been conceptualized. Obviously, if we take the racialization of religion as an example of cultural racism, it is vital to explain what do we mean by culture. And here is also one particular important ground also for applying the categories of post-colonial and intersectional analysis that my predecessors have already conjured. And why? Because evidently religion becomes an identity marker, religion is assimilated to culture, and if culture is narrated as a kind of monolith, in fact, non-changeable, eternal, ahistorical, non-negotiable, so to say, so is religion. But here, this is also what is extremely important. This view of culture that is typical of right-wing political movements, but unfortunately not solely, because sometimes this view of culture as a monolith, much to our, how can I say, disgrace and peril and harm, etc., has been naively also assumed by a part of the left, that somehow has used this notion of culture, therefore falling into what? Falling into some of the, as you know, the aporie, if you want, some of the pitch, some of the paradoxes of a version of multiculturalism that somehow only thinks, there are monoliths, those monoliths cannot be destroyed, but you just will leave them there and that's it. This is their culture and we froze them into this culture. To this, I would like also to recommend very much, and this is also especially for the students, I would recommend to you very much to read Anne Phillips, a British scholar that in fact instead has written this wonderful book, Multiculturalism Without Culture, in which, in fact, she affirms that culture is not a monolith, but is the result of a series of daily negotiations. Now, what, in fact, is happening in contemporary Italian discourse is, to a certain extent, a reenactment of one of the mechanisms that we know very well now about the colonial mechanism of othering. Because, in fact, here we can see that there is the creation of the other, there is the denial of difference, but the denial of difference, let's say, denying the possibility of difference, is not solely that I do not accept Gaia Giuliani because she's different from me, but I do not accept the internal differences of Gaia Giuliani. That is to say, the typical colonial mechanism of othering somehow flats down the difference, and this is particularly evident in Islam, where, of course, there is no difference, there is no internal nuance, there is no internal, how can I say, conflict. And this is also here, I would like to quote one very enlightening sentence of the great anthropologist Lila Abu Logwood, when she says that we Westerners, we claim that we are the only one that are capable of elaborating moral principles because we Westerners, we claim for ourselves moral reflexivity. And this is exactly the capacity that we deny to others. Therefore, when we believe in God, it's because it's an act of moral reflexivity. If someone else believes in God, it's simply because he or she is part of a culture. So here, I would also say that somehow this kind of creation of othering denies other religions essentially what? Denies other religion a place within modernity. And here, I would like to quote the great philosopher, Charles Taylor, because in fact, Charles Taylor in his monumental work, The Secular Age, 2007, another reading that I mean, one cannot escape these days. Charles Taylor has said something that, secularization doesn't mean that religion disappears, but secularization is about the profound transformation of the conditions of belief, whereby in the modern age, where, the passage through secularization has happened, religious belief become the result of a reflexive choice. They are not by default. And exactly the kind of, how can I say, hiding of otherness that this kind of racialization of religion denies the other religion, in particular Islam. But I think somehow we could also, Catherine, extend it also to the case of the Sikh that you have said. No, they love cows so much. How can they not love cows? Somehow this is a symptom of this mechanism. Obviously, let's say all of this has a direct application. As a matter of fact, this is a little bit of a part of a by now, long study on right-wing populism, and in particular what is special about the populist notion of people. And in fact, what, not I, but I embrace the view of those who say that what is characteristics of the most important character of populism is not so much the opposition between the common people and the elite, as much as what is important about populism is the notion of people as a homogeneous community that is absolutely incapable of accepting pluralism. You can very well understand why, if this is the conception of people of populism, you can see how important becomes the manipulation of religion and how much, as a matter of fact, religion is becoming more and more an identity marker, not solely in theoretical construct, but actually, as it can be measured also, how can I say, empirically. One last word about, let's say, the Italian case, and then I think how many minutes do I have, Davide? Comunque, I'm going to be brief because I'm sure that you all want to proceed to the discussion. Allora, as you can see here in this slide, for those of you who were in Italy the past spring, you can recognize this image, because this is now our Minister of Interior, Matteo Salvini, that essentially has conducted the electoral campaign of the spring of 2018 with a great waving of rosaries. Actually, Matteo Salvini was thinking of the possibility of hanging rosaries in those same Italian ports that he wants to close to ships rescuing children died at sea. So this is what the idea would be. Then for some reason he has somehow dropped this plan of his, but otherwise he wanted to use a prayer instrument to the memory of the crucified in order to signify those ports don't offer shelter to people dying, period. Allora, what does it mean essentially? Vedete, this is also another, how can I say, poster, no? And I don't give the translation, otherwise my colleagues, you know, the teacher of Italian, then, you know, there is this kind of myth around Villa La Pietra, the spin is teaching students the bad words. And so I don't want in any way, you know, to confirm this. Però vedete how it is possible. It is possible somehow because, and here I would like to use the work of a British sociologist, Grace Davis, that in a book of 1999 about religion in Britain, she has created these categories that then have been widely used to describe religious practices in Europe, that is to say, believing or belonging. That is to say that we can see that religion in a post-secular society can follow two, how can I say, opposite, rather than parallel, two opposite directions. One is somehow the direction of believing without belonging. This direction of believing without belonging was part of what was the most popular broadcast about the future of religion in Europe, and therefore also about the future of religion in Italy. And why? Because, as you know, there was for a long time a kind of, you know, grounded belief that we were going to proceed towards more secularization, and therefore people were going to elaborate very, how can I say, interiorized, very personal, very individualized forms of religion. The typical approach to religion of the person that says, oh no, I don't go to church, I do not belong to any denomination, but I have my God inside me. But then there is the other form of religious life, that is the form of belonging, where somehow one person considers to be part of a religious group, not so much when he or she shares a set of beliefs, but rather when he or she shares a set of practices. Therefore, you know, when religion becomes a way of life. Interestingly enough, and somehow contrary to the great tradition of classic sociology from Weber downwards, evidently, yes, of course, we are still continuing now in the way of the believing without belonging, but definitely nowadays in European public discourse, and Italy is no exception, we can see definitely an approach to religion as belonging without believing, which makes it so that those forces, such as, for example, the Lega, former Nord, now only Lega, however they call themselves, somehow they can, in fact, how can I say, disregard all the dogmatic part of Christianity and still claim that Christianity is part of our way of life, is part of our culture. And here I would like to quote, for example, the great scholar Renzo Guolo, that has spoken of the Northern League as an example of Christianity without Christ, Cristianesimo senza Cristo. In particular, I would say the predicament of the Lega in this moment is particularly interesting. Why? Because somehow the Lega now finds itself at odds. E perché? Because somehow, on the one hand, the Lega needs to master the cultural heritage of Catholicism, and yet at the same time, the Lega has a fiercely anti-national past. So now they find themselves a little bit in a catch-22 situation, whether, you know, embracing Catholicism without, at the same time, embracing, let's say, what has been one of the, how can I say, standards, also one of the battleground, if you want, of the Italian Catholic Church, that is the identification of Italian culture and Catholicism, which of course explains also a lot, if you want, of the apparent contradictions of the Northern League. To close, I would like definitely to say that as my predecessor has shown, I am quoting, race in Italy is a tricky matter. And indeed, race in Italy is a tricky matter, but I would also say religion in Italy is a tricky matter, because as well as the analysis of contemporary discourse also shows that Italians have never really solved the glitch of race, the knot and the glitch of color, but evidently the revamping of religious symbolism, of religious discourse, of manipulation of religion that definitely characterizes at the moment the Italian public discourse also shows that Italy definitely has an issue with secularization. I would like, and with, with a genuine secular approach to politics and for a genuine separation of church and state, I would like to close by recalling one fact, and the fact is, as you know for sure, that Italy does not have a comprehensive law on religious freedom. We do not have a law on religious freedom. Confessions other than the Roman Catholic Church regulate their relationship with the Italian state by means of a series of intese, of special agreements. At the moment, as you know, the Union of the Muslim Communities in Italy is negotiating its intesa with the Stato Italiano, using as consultants people that are coming from other religious minorities. But the bottom line is, in this country, there is not one law on religious freedom. The rights of religious confessions are negotiated case by case. I would say this says a lot. Let me fermo qui.
Thanks, Professor Spini, for yet adding another layer to this mapping and complexity they've been drawing today in the discourse on race and discrimination. I think we are really ready for the discussion, so I open the floor right away for questions to our panel.
First of all, thank you all for the very intriguing and interesting presentation. And especially I would like to thank really Deborah, because she addressed a question I had this morning, this very first panel, which is, I was wondering if the myth of the good Italian would never die because Italy is a Catholic country. And if we think about Balilla and fascism, young, how to say, placed together. The Balilla team were so strong that even the Catholic Association of Youngsters were banned from the fascism. But they were banned, but all the Catholic youngsters went together in being the Balilla, young Balilla. And that, I think, is a very important point to consider in maybe the myth of good Italian. But the question is, the last word you said. You said we do not have a law about freedom of religion. And I was wondering about the Constitution. What do you mean? I mean, we have the first article of Constitution saying that we are free to believe. So I just wanted to clarify to myself, please.
Shall I clarify this constitutional point?
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to address a question to all the three speakers, because my impression, also thinking about what I have talked about and all my colleagues and friends from this morning, is I think that we have stressed a lot the continuity of racism from modern time, colonialism, racialized identity, which happened in modern time in specific periods, and that there is, my impression is that there is continuity. So my question, especially because you are dealing with contemporary forms of racism, is do you see some new, different ways of racializing identity and otherness? I think to some extent that Deborah has always given one perspectives about belonging without believing. It's a process of secularization maybe that has changed and has been adapted to modern times. So I would like also to address this question to Gaia and Angelica. Do you see some changes, fundamental changes, or is it all somehow reducible to the past, to the genealogy that you have described, to fascism, or maybe before, we're going back to the 19th century? Is there something fundamental new, or is it only repetition of what we know from the past? That's my question. Thank you.
We can begin the answer. Who wants? You want to? Angelica, you want to?
So the question is a very interesting question, actually. I think more than noticing something fundamentally new, I think from what I can see is an adaptation of a new context, but definitely there are some practices that have traveled through history, but they readapt. So now that we have this so-called refugee crisis, so I think how we have resignified certain behavior. So it means that, as I said, race was there, but as Stuart Hall says, is a floating signifier, right? So I think if we think about citizenship, specifically second generation, new Italians, there are definitely some pattern coming from the fascist regime, but even earlier, but also some new forms of adaptations in a way.
I would speak about recombination. Since that, think about homo-nationalism. We had no homo-nationalism 50 years ago. For instance. But, I mean, we are playing with the same cards. It's about gender, it's about sexuality. Maybe we have a new element that could be, I don't know, a particular articulation of religion within a particular national context or a area context. So, of course, each and every historical context is different, but there are global trajectories or similarities that actually makes word kind of a similar pot, very kind of. But same time, yeah, I'll talk about recombination. Infinite recombination. I mean, I'm not talking about a closed system. So it really depends on the power election that are inferring on that context, depends on the actors, depends on the symbolic materials which is available. That recombines the colonial archive or the national cultural archive. What kind of figures from race are recombined? So is unpredictable in my opinion, but the material, let's say, the factors, the elements, the schemes, some dynamics, there is a continuity, I guess.
So you mean that the rules of the game are the same?
Exactly. In the cards, so as well, depends.
I will begin from the last question, also because I think that this term that Professor Giuliani has brought up to the table, the recombination, is very It is absolutely fit, because I would say, as far as secularization is concerned and religion is concerned, definitely, you know, it sounds something that comes from, you know, somehow the most distant past. Religion is back. Question is how religion is recombined. Because also, I would say it is particularly interesting when one makes a more in-depth analysis of the discourse of right-wing political parties, not so much Italian right-wing populists, because, you know, they're not that sophisticated, as you can imagine, but, you know, more sophisticated forms of right-wing populism in Europe, what would they affirm? They would affirm that the superiority of the Christian religion, because only the Christian religion is capable of secularizing. So somehow what is interesting is the recombination. So on the one hand, you can now save the religious identity, that it's so important as an identity marker, and yet at the same time, there is also the possibility of capturing, let's say, a progressive discourse by saying, we are Christian, therefore we can secularize, and only Christianity is the religion that allows you now to do this in and out from religion. That is the only barrier against fundamentalism. I would say, if there is something probably new that is not solely a recombination but is genuinely something new, I would say, is the manipulation of sexual democracy. Because on the one hand, it is true that the manipulation of sexual democracy shows now the desire of maintaining the control of the feminine body, that somehow is the shared sacred, etc., etc. We all know this. But at the same time, there is also something else. That is to say, here the sociologist of reference, I would say Eric Fassin, no? And the studies about sexual democracy. But in general, I would say on the theoretical level, the literature that somehow deals of the strange liaison dangereuse between feminism and neoliberalism. This is the way to go. Definitely, how can I say, the affirmation that there is a kind of, you know, legitimate aspiration to sex, and this is part, let's say, of the social imaginary. This is probably something new, I would say. Poi, then one has to do all the criticism. About the Constitution. Allora, let me try to explain. Obviously, the Italian Constitution affirms freedom of religion. Però, then what do you have? It is true that this Article 1, etc., etc. Then there is Article 7. Article 7 of the Italian Constitution states that the Roman Catholic Church is the only official religion of the Italian state, and that the relationship with other confessions have to be regolati da intese. And as you know, this is Article 7. How was this Article 7 voted when Italy became a democracy? It was the year of the Lord 1947. This article came into being because the Italian Communist Party, in order to do a favor to the Democrazia Cristiana and to the Catholic Church, abstained. What is the reasoning? And here, I'm sorry, I have to become a little bit technical, because definitely the Italian left has been suffering for a long time of a misunderstood materialism, whereby whatever has to do with religion is, you know, in the wake of Marx, the opium of the people, and sooner or later, you know, the evolution of the proletariat and of the working class will make it so that we shall discard this whole thing that is religion. So therefore, you know, for the Italian Communist Party, what was the priority? The priority was to have an alliance and somehow to maintain a modus vivendi with the Catholic Church. What they cared for was welfare and to have more welfare, and so they needed the alliance with the social doctrine of the Church, the right of the workers. E arrivederci. Then, as you know, this has been partially reformed in 1983, because in 1983 there has been a revision of the Article 7, and also in 1983, because I forgot to say something, that the Article 7 is somehow absorbs into the Italian Constitution. That's the important point. The Article 7 absorbs into the Italian Constitution the Lateran Pacts of, I think, you know, February 18 or 13, 1929, signed between the Holy See and the fascist government, whereby Mussolini gave the Pope, the City of Vatican, some money to have the Vatican finance the status of the official religion of the Italian state. Quindi, let's say, Italian democracy has been born, you know, with this kind of internal enclave of a special agreement. So this is what I was saying when somehow race is a tricky matter in Italy, but also religion is a tricky matter.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoy all speech, and I'm not quite familiar with Italian racism, but particularly I quite interested in Angelica's talk, because what's happening is a kind of a self-racism, self-whitenization, if you like. So usually, we had some discussion at the lunchtime. So-called ethnicity in the center tend to be unmarked. Always, talk about the other ethnicities. But what's happening at the moment in many parts of the world, not just in Italy, in Japan, or even Australia as well. I'm from Australia. It's a mostly discourse is anti-migration, anti-migrant within our national borders. So it's a quite protectionist or defensive in a sense. So in this, I think, circumstances, so kind of racism or jingoism is a kind of more introverted, not against outside the border, but all inside the borders. And also it is no longer possible to unmark itself in this kind of situation. So there are many instances, I think, not just Italy. Let me repeat, of so kind of centeredness, or be it a whiteness or Japaneseness or Chineseness, is being more expressive about. But it is, of course, impossible to nicely define what it means to be Italian, what it means Japanese or white. So I think this kind of, I'm not sure, these are some comments on this kind of, I think quite kind of new for me. Of course, it's an old kind of self-racism or self-whitenization is not new, but I think current situation shows some kind of newness about this kind of white self-racism, if you like, or self-whitenization, because it's become more aggressive against others, to attacking others. So this is something happening in Japan as well, about hate speech, of course. Mm-hmm. So it's quite different from old, more implicit racism. So it's quite, I think, interesting. I don't know how to theorize this kind of development. And also, I'm quite curious in the Italian case how digital communication lends itself to the rise of this kind of racism at the moment. In Japan, yeah, it's digital communication technology, social media, has played a very important role in disseminating this kind of racist actions among wider publics. So I'm not quite sure in the Italian case how, this is also the case with Italia.
So your first comment was about, you were saying self-racism. Okay, so this, well, what I'm thinking about it, listening to your comment, is maybe this idea of internal racism, right? And as we have saying today, for Italians, where it was quite difficult to become white because this idea of not being Aryan, so they struggled a lot. There was a lot of theorization about the pollution of Italian blood. And then I think, yeah, this is when really Bianco e Nero, this book published in 2012, gave us a fantastic new perspective to analyze how, before going to the colonies, there was an internal colonization, the southern, the dark other. So when you read Diaries of the Patriots, for example, it just comes to my mind Luigi Farini, who said, this is not Italy, this is Africa. And so it has been really difficult to exit this subaltern kind of whiteness, because I think Italian whiteness has always been very fragile. They needed to prove themselves to be extra white than the others. And yeah, in terms of social media, I think it's a very important point, also because of a lack of legislation on it, and sexism, and all your intervention made me think about the importance of the intersectional approach, because we don't have a law that express freedom of religion, but we don't have a law, an anti-homophobia law, transphobia law at the moment in Italy. And when they tried to pass the bill, I remember at the time Bottiglione saying, we can't have an anti-homophobia law because it discriminates heterosexuals. Mm-hmm. And now in terms of social media and violence, we have a lot of cases of NP, especially women, being targeted, and we also see how Salvini makes a strategic use of social media to spread these racist messages, which I think is also a kind of global pattern. Yes. So I don't know if you want to add something about it.
Yeah. Yes, I was thinking always about patchworks. Since that in the media, in the social medias, what you find is a patchwork of different symbolic materials, unfiltered, or better, even more filtered than the usual, because they are recombined along maps of meanings, let's say. So that what we get is that the boat people landing in Lampedusa are like animals, cannibals, zombies. And you understand that there is a new map of meanings working, reworking that material so that it is quite immediate to think about those people as attempting the very basic fundamental values of our society, so spreading moral panic. And it's unfiltered, and at the same time, so much filtered. So, of course, the platform on which these meanings are recombined is very new. There's not such a thing. There was not such a thing 30 years ago. There was television, and it was already another stage, let's say, very different from what used to be, or used to be before, and so on and so forth. Level of recombination, of course, have to do also with technology. Technology as a knowledge production device. But the border is a technology. So even the idea of the proliferation of borders, as Nicola de Genova talks about, is precisely that. So there are so many different factors that we need to take into account in order to be able to give back a sort of an image that could be likely, I guess. And the last thing I wanted to say is going back. Do I have 30 seconds? Yes. Yeah.
Chair?
Okay.
Yes.
Because I don't know, going back to your questions, combining your questions, I mean, I was recently thinking about, again, the boat crossing the Mediterranean. And I was thinking, what was the relation between the slave ship and this boat? And I was thinking about how the repository of that particular colonial and slavery meanings are somehow crystallized, ossified the two images. And there is an opposition, a clear opposition, for instance. The material is the same, but there is a total opposition. And I'll tell you why. Because why, I mean, I don't understand, I mean, at the beginning it was like, because why the boat that crosses the Mediterranean is so full of fears, engender fears, and the slave ship didn't engender any bloody fear, but same material. Two different moments in history, but same material. And I was like, okay, in the slave ship, everybody was tired. Everybody could not move. And in the boat crossing the Mediterranean, everybody is potentially free. Of course not, but he wants to cross the Mediterranean. So same material, two completely different images.
I think we should ask if Professor Garau Garau, are you there?
Are you there?
Yes, she is. How do we? Professor, non
No.
sembra essere.
No, sir.
Can hear you.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Professor Garau, are you
Yes.
there?
Yes, I am. Can you
Oh,
hear me?
I am. Very good. So we wanted to ask you if you are, if you could follow a little bit the discussion was going on, if you had any comment that you wanted to add.
I hope you can hear me. The only thing I wanted to add is about the Northern League discovering God or discovering religion. And I think this is a very interesting turn into the League strategy, and it's a turn that it took in the in 2006 pretty much, when they tried to kind of turn into a franchise their strategy, the party. The relationship between the Northern League and the Catholic Church is very interesting, I think. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me? Yeah. And it changed over time from a complicated relationship in the early 1990s to a more opportunistic approach recently, when the League, around 2006, 2007, started presenting itself as the last defense for an identity under threat. Among the enemies of the Northern League, we've got three categories, and the others are national, but one is a category framed through religion. So it's all Muslims as non-assimilable immigrants, and the language the League uses to refer to these Muslim immigrants always uses war metaphors. The Muslims are a bomb ready to explode, bomb hanging our head, hanging on the future of our children. They talk about trenches, war, battles, and they describe this battle as Christianity versus Islam. And the church has always been very critical of the Northern League, and recently, again, we saw the cover of the magazine Famiglia Cristiana with the title Va de retro Salvini. So it's becoming even more radical in the critique of the Northern League, Nevertheless, I think the strategy of the League and its opportunistic use of religion is really important, because he established another breach with Italian society from the south as well. If you think of the importance the Catholics still as they in Italy.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any last question that we can take? Any last question? Okay, then we can conclude this panel and give the word and the floor to our conclusion. Thank you very much. The conclusion remarks by Professor Simone.
First of all, I really want to thank you all for being here and for staying with us until this very late hour. And because it's already very late, I'm certainly not going to draw very articulate conclusions. I'm not going to repeat what have been the main themes, or not in an articulated way anyway. I think that the question of the continuity and the connection between past and present has been prominent here from various points of view, talking about taking the colonial perspective, or looking at legislation, or looking at representation. So I think these are part of the languages that we wanted to somehow draw out of this workshop. And I think that this theme has emerged consistently. One thing that other maybe keywords that have come out and have returned are the question of the non-assimilability, or the question that minorities, whether because of religion or race or gender, are not assimilable within the Italian white Catholic context, which is something that has been repeated over and over and over for Africans during the colonial experience, for Jews during during fascism and racial laws, and during the Second World War, and so on and so forth. And another thing that I think should be mentioned is the anxiety about the presence of these others in this Italian white Catholic normatively white context. And this anxiety emerges in these numbers that flow around. If you ask how many Jews are there in Italy today, or how many Muslims, or how many Chinese, numbers explode to millions of people that threaten, again, the nation and the body politic of the nation, I would say. I think that the question of intersectionality, which has just come up, is also very important, and the question of gender should maybe be addressed could have figured more prominently because it's a very important element. And together with that, which comes together with the myth of the good Italian, which we've been trying to beat a little bit down, is the question of right-wing versus left-wing policies, or the attitudes of right-wing parties, and how the left has not reacted to the perpetuation of stereotypes. And we've been saying, somehow several of us have said this, well, the racism comes from the right, but then the left is not able to propose a strong strategy to counteract it, and therefore perpetuates it as a joke, which is the way that stereotypes continue to be fed, both at a very serious and threatening, in a threatening way, but in a lighter way, which is not less dangerous. I don't know if I'm making myself understood, but the fact that the left-wing parties have not been able to counteract this for whatever reason beats, again, the myth of the good Italian, and speaks volumes about the permanence of the continuity of racism in a generalized way. I think that's, there could be other themes, but I think we just want to go for our light reception, which will come in a minute. But before that, I have to say two things. First of all, is our plans for the future, if we have some plans. Well, David and I, while we were organizing this, we encountered a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest, really, in this topic. So first of all, we still have to think about how this is going to happen, but we would like to proceed with maybe producing a volume for this out of the contributes, out of the papers that you have presented at this conference. We will elaborate a little bit a project, and you'll hear from us sometime soon when we recover from this in the near future. And again, I think that the issues of languages is going to be the ways in which racism finds expression in this country historically is going to be central. And as I said, because we encountered a lot of enthusiasm and interest, we were fantasizing, I think, about giving to this meeting some sort of continuity for the future. But this belongs to the future, so we cannot say anything about this. But stay tuned, because we will get back to you on that. So we will not escape from this network now that you've been caught here. So this is it. It's time for thanking Ellen Toscano, first of all, for supporting us and for encouraging us to proceed with this conference, and to our colleagues of the EDI, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, for sharing many discussions and the work with us. And then the speakers, of course, the students who stayed with us, and our logistical team here, Megan Metters, Lucia Ferroni, Maria Mihailovic, Mikol Visciano, who no longer works here but has been fundamental, and our IT team, and I think that's global, of course, which is above us and in the room. And let's go for our light reception. Everybody's invited. Thank you very much. Posso fare? No, non c'è.